Old Testament lesson 14. Ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me. So last week we talked about freedom from Egyptian rule. Moses leading the children of Israel out, parting the sea, and then Pharaoh's armies being buried under the water. So we pick up this week right after that in the story, once they're across the water and Pharaoh's armies are no more and they're safe in the wilderness, as safe as one can be in the wilderness. Back then, the wilderness was not a friendly place to be, especially in that part of the world. And so safe is somewhat of a relative term there. After passing through the Sea of Reeds, Red Sea is most likely a mistranslation. It's probably the Sea of Reeds. Moses was to lead the Israelites to the Promised Land. That was the goal, to get to the Promised Land. That's a journey of about 240 miles. Does anybody remember how long it takes before they get there and move in to the Promised Land? About 40 years. 40 years is a long time to go 240 miles. But they actually got to the Promised Land not too long after leaving Pharaoh's armies behind. They got to the outskirts and they sent 12 Israelite scouts to gather information, and they came back and they said that the land was full of milk and honey. But what else was there? Well, formidable Canaanite forces, giants, which caused all of the scouts that came back. They talked about, the land of milk and honey and how great it was, but all of them except for Joshua and Caleb said we shouldn't go. We can't get in. It's too risky. And this caused the people to lose heart. So even though they were on the outskirts of the Promised Land, many of them actually, in Numbers 14, we read that they wanted to return to their slavery in Egypt. They didn't even, they hadn't even been there, just on the word of these 10 scouts, because remember, Caleb and Joshua said that they could do it. They were going to go back to their slavery in Egypt. And at one point, they were even about to stone Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb, but who kept trying to encourage them to remain obedient and courageous, but they wouldn't listen. So later on in Numbers 14, we read where it says, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day a year you shall bear your iniquity, 40 years. So the Israelite scouts were in the land for 40 days, and that's how many years the Lord was going to make them wander in the wilderness. Exodus says about 600,000 men left Egypt. So, assume more than double that when you count for women and children. How many of those in the original group that left Egypt made it to the Promised Land? Only 2, Joshua and Caleb. That's it. Everyone else who was over 20 years old at the time of this died in the wilderness. So 40 years and everyone over 20 dead seems like a harsh punishment. So let's back up a little bit and let's see what happened between the time that they left the Sea of Reeds and got to the Promised Land. One of the first things that happened, not long at all after they left Pharaoh's army behind, is they start running out of water, right? They get across the Sea of Reeds. Pharaoh's army is wiped out. They're wandering into the desert, the wilderness, and they don't have any water. And that's a lot of people, 600,000 men plus women and children. That's a lot of water that's needed to keep them going every day. So they finally find some, but it's bitter. And they start complaining. And so they go to Moses, and Moses gets a tree. Well, the Lord tells him to throw a tree in it. So Moses throws a tree in the water, and it makes it sweet. So the Lord gives them water through Moses. Well, not long after this, they start thinking about food and the kind of food that they like and not having food. And they reminisce about Egypt. And it says they ate bread until they were full and sat by the flesh pots, or, kind of meat stew. So they complain. God says, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? But he does provide for the people. He gives them manna in the mornings, quail in the evenings. The manna, he tells them, just gather enough for one day. You don't need to hoard it. There'll be more tomorrow, but some people do hoard it, and then it goes bad, gets rotten. And then he does say, though, on the sixth day to gather 2 days' worth so that you don't have to gather on the Sabbath. But there's some people who only gather one day, and then on the Sabbath they go out to get more and complain because there's none out there, even though it's the Sabbath. So the Lord is trying to provide for them, and, just like us, sometimes we make it difficult for the Lord to bless us. Not long after this miracle where the manna started happening, they run into another incident where they have no water. For a second time, a lack of water. And this time, the people blame Moses to the point where Moses is concerned that they're going to stone him. And he goes to the Lord and he says, I need some help here. They're about to stone me because there's no water. What does the Lord tell him to do? Use his rod and hit a rock, and water will come out. So that's what he did. And incidentally, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it refers to this incident, and the physical water from a rock was provided by the Lord. And in the New Testament, spiritual water, which is Christ, is also provided by the Lord. 1 Nephi 11 teaches that water represents the love of God, and John 4 teaches that we will never thirst if we drink of that water. So, a lot of symbolism here, but at any rate, the Lord blessed them, gave them a miracle again. So, it's not long at all after they get across the Sea of Reeds. They're complaining about water. The Lord gives them water. They're complaining about food. The Lord gives them food. They complain about water again. The Lord gives them more water. And then after this, they finally make it to Mount Sinai. And what happens at Mount Sinai is really the crux. What sets them on the path to have to wander 40 years in the wilderness. The Lord wanted to establish a covenant with the Israelites. When they were camped at Sinai, the Lord promised that if the Israelites were obedient, he would make them a peculiar treasure, a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. Peculiar, obviously, in this context, means special or set apart or treasured, but not so much odd or weird or anything. So they're camped outside Sinai, and the Lord wanted to meet with and speak to his people face to face. And he wanted to give them instructions face to face. He wanted to talk to them. And we read about that in Exodus 19:9 and 11, and also in Doctrine and Covenants 84. The Lord instructed Moses to sanctify the people so that they would be ready to meet the Lord. Now, real quick, what we're going to talk about here, about what's happening at Mount Sinai, a lot of it is going to come from the Joseph Smith translation. Joseph Smith provided a wealth of information, particularly in the JST, on the events that took place at Mount Sinai. Some of the things that he taught was that God intended to make the higher or Melchizedek priesthood available to all Israel, but because of what they did and their actions, instead ended up giving the lesser priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, to the tribe of Levi. God cursed the Israelites with a carnal law, omitting from the second set of tablets elements of the higher law, including the covenant of the priesthood that had been in the first set of tablets. And the higher law was to be restored through Christ at a later time. So while the Bible gives partial support to, the last one there, and it barely hints at the first one, it really doesn't say anything about the Israelites' rejection of the higher priesthood and the fact that the two sets of tablets differed in their context. But it's not just Joseph Smith that taught this. We've got some quotes from the Zohar here. The Zohar is a foundational work in the literature of Jewish mystical thought known as Kabbalah. It first appeared in Spain in the 13th century, published by a Jewish writer named Moses de Leon, who ascribed the work to Shimon bar, however you say that. The majority, or traditionally, the teachings of the Kabbalah were viewed as being revealed by God to biblical figures such as Abraham and Moses, and then orally transmitted on down until the time they were written by, supposedly Shimon bar Yochai. But modern academic analysis of the Zohar theorizes that Leon himself is the author. But at any rate, the Zohar is, much older than Joseph Smith, and likely the content in it is much older than the 13th century. So we'll talk a little bit about the Zohar. We're going to be using the Joseph Smith translation. But anyways, back to the story. So we're camped at Mount Sinai. The people were unwilling to talk with God. They wanted Moses to be their intermediary, and we read about that in Exodus, but also in the Doctrine and Covenants. A couple of places you can see right there. It says in Doctrine and Covenants 107, they rejected the responsibility of being a kingdom of priests, and with it rejected the higher priesthood that holds the keys of communing directly with God. And then also in Doctrine and Covenants section 84, verses 23 to 25, it says, "Now this Moses plainly taught to the children of Israel in the wilderness, and sought diligently to sanctify his people, that they might behold the face of God. But they hardened their hearts, and could not endure his presence. Therefore the Lord in his wrath, for his anger was kindled against them, swore that they should not enter into his rest while in the wilderness, which rest is fullness of his glory. Therefore he took Moses out of their midst, and the holy priesthood also." So in Exodus, they hear the Ten Commandments coming out of the cloud with the thunder and the lightning, and they all get scared and take off and tell Moses, "We want you to be between us and God." And so then Moses goes up and meets with God, and the people are left to do what they do at the base of the mountain. So from this, Moses brought down the two different sets of tablets, and we get a little bit of a hint in the Bible that the law given to Israel through Moses was a lesser law. It doesn't really speak of the higher law written on the first set of tablets, but it does give us some hints. Here in Ezekiel it says, "I lifted up mine hand unto them also in the wilderness, that I would scatter them among the heathen, and disperse them through the countries, because they had not executed my judgments, Wherefore I gave them also statutes that were not good, and judgments whereby they should not live. So he doesn't say that the statutes are bad. He just says that they are not good, suggesting that there could have been something better. But the higher law, the better law, as Joseph Smith taught, was replaced by this lesser law of carnal commandments. It's not good statutes. This is also suggested in the Lord's word to Jeremiah. And Jeremiah chapter 7, For I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this thing commanded I them, saying, Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well unto you. But they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear, but walked in the counsels and in the imagination of their evil heart, and went backward, not forward. This passage actually cites Exodus 19:5, in which the Lord commanded the Israelites assembled at the foot of Mount Sinai to obey him. It was only after they disobeyed that he imposed this lesser law that was more complex, with offerings and sacrifices and such. So, 2 sets of tablets, 2 sets of laws. If we look at Exodus chapter 34, verses 1 and 2, it says, And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 tablets of stone, write unto the first, like unto the first, and I will write upon these tablets the words which were in the first tablet which thou breakest. And be ready in the morning, and come up in the morning unto Mount Sinai, and present thyself unto me in the top of the mount. So, Exodus 1 and 2, it almost sounds like the second set of tablets are going to be identical to the first, when the Lord says, I will write upon these tablets the words that were in the first tablets. But when you look at the Joseph Smith translation, it fills it out a little bit. It says, And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 other tablets of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon them also the words of the law, according as they were written at the first on the tablets which thou breakest. But it shall not be according to the first, for I will take away the priesthood out of their midst. Therefore my holy order and the ordinances thereof shall not go before them. For my presence shall not go up in their midst, lest I destroy them. But I will give unto them the law as at the first. But it shall be after the law of a carnal commandment. For I have sworn in my wrath that they shall not enter into my presence, enter into my rest in the days of their pilgrimage. Therefore do as I have commanded thee, and be ready in the morning, and come up in the morning unto Mount Sinai, and present thyself there unto me in the top of the mount. So, using the Joseph Smith translation, we see that there was some significant differences between the first set of tablets and the second set of tablets. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, we see a similar thing happen. At the time that the Lord said unto me, Hew thee 2 tablets of stone like unto the first, and come up unto me into the mount, and make thee an ark of wood. And I will write on the tablets the words which were in the first tablets which thou breakest, and thou shalt put them in the ark. Similar thing. And then when we look in the Joseph Smith translation, at the time that the Lord said unto me, Hew thee 2 other tables of stone like unto the first, and come up unto me unto the mount, and make thee an ark of wood, and I will write on the tables the words that were on the first tables which thou breakest, save the words of the everlasting covenant of the holy priesthood, and thou shalt put them in the ark. So we see in both of these, the Joseph Smith translation adds some significant information there. And also, not just in the Old Testament and the Joseph Smith translation, but also in the Zohar. Here in the Book of Rules, which is attributed to the 1st century AD Christian writer. So this isn't the Zohar, excuse me. We'll get to the Zohar. This is in the Book of Rules, attributed to the 1st century AD Christian writer Clement of Rome. He cites Noah as an instruction to Shem regarding the burial of Adam, then adds, Thus it was written in the tables which Moses received from the hand of the Lord, and broke at the time of his anger against his people. It's interesting because since the words attributed to Noah are not found in the Old Testament books attributed to Moses, it kind of implies that the first set of tablets given to Moses contained information that was omitted from the second set of tablets that we now have. This passage it's confirmed also in a book called the Epistle of Barnabas, which gives a similar account right here. The Epistle of Barnabas is a Greek epistle containing 21 chapters. Is preserved complete in the 4th century, was actually in the first collections of the New Testament. It's traditionally ascribed to Barnabas, who is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, although some ascribe it to another apostolic father of the same name, Barnabas of Alexandria, or some people just say it was unknown. But at any rate, it says kind of the same thing. It says, "But let us inquire if the Lord has really given that testament which he swore to the fathers that he would give to the people. He did give it, but they were not worthy to receive it. On account of their sins, Moses received from the Lord 2 tables, written in the Spirit by the finger of the hand of the Lord. And Moses, having received them, carried them down to give to the people. And Moses understood that they had again made molten images, and he threw the tables out of his hands, and the tables of the testament of the Lord were broken. Moses then received it, but they, the Israelites, proved themselves unworthy. Learn now how we, as Christians, have received it. Moses, as a servant, received it, but the Lord himself, having suffered in our behalf, hath given it to us, that we should be the people of the inheritance." So, in the Epistle of Barnabas, which was in the first New Testament collections, we see that they also talked about the differences between the first set of tablets and the second set of tablets. And most people agree that the Messiah came to restore the law. In the Zohar, in Leviticus 23:8, it quotes Rabbi Judah as saying, "God will one day reveal the hidden mysteries of the Torah, namely at the time of the Messiah." And then he cites Isaiah 11 and Jeremiah 31, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then in Leviticus 22b, "As long as Moses was alive, he used to check Israel from sinning against God. And because Moses was among them, there shall not be a generation like that one till the Messiah comes, when they shall see the glory of God like him." And finally, another Jewish tradition found in the Babylonian Talmud, which says that when the Israelites accepted the covenant at Sinai and were made a kingdom of priests, they received 2 crowns. But when they removed the crowns, destroying angels snatched them away. It is believed that the faithful will receive those crowns during the Messianic age. So we had 2 sets of tablets. Early Jewish writers and early Christian writers understood that there was 2 laws. And Joseph Smith taught that, restored that, if you will. The first law was to make them a kingdom of priests and a holy kingdom, but they weren't sanctified. Moses couldn't get them to a point where they could see God face to face and get the law given to them, and so a lesser carnal law was given, and with the expectation that when the Messiah came, he would restore it. And in Hebrews 12:24, when Jesus, who is the Messiah, came, it identifies him as the mediator of the new covenant. And the term new covenant was drawn from Jeremiah's prophecy, that same one that the Zohar quoted, Jeremiah 31 to 34. "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, for the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So Jesus, the Messiah, is coming with a new covenant. This new covenant is not going to be etched in stone as the Ten Commandments and the carnal law. It's going to be etched in their hearts. And we see Jesus doing this in his teachings. He obviously fulfills the law, and he is bringing that new law that's etched on their hearts. If we look at the Sermon on the Mount, he kind of takes everything one step further, right? Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Rather than simply prohibit murder, the Savior commanded his disciples to even avoid anger. He taught that the way to avoid committing sexual sins was to banish lustful thoughts from your mind. Honesty of speech is superior to having to swear oaths to establish one's truthfulness. Love is superior to revenge. Jesus spoke of the law of Moses in the Sermon on the Mount, which he also gave to the Nephites when he got to the New World. And he did emphasize, it's important to keep the commandments found in the law, but he added all of this, taking it one step further. He then went on, to illustrate what he meant as he gave the Sermon on the Mount. So, under the law of Moses, obedience was enforced by fear of punishment. It was etched in stone. You knew what you had to do. You didn't do it, you were going to get punishment. Sometimes you were stoned or executed. But the law of justice required punishment for the sins. When Christ came, he brought the law of mercy. So we are free from the punishment of sin, providing we repent. So, while the law of Moses was written on the tablets of stone, as Jeremiah said, the law of Christ is written on the heart and in the thoughts of his followers. Our motivation for obedience to the law of God should not be fear of punishment or hope of reward. Rather, we should be motivated by a love of God and by our desire to do right. This is what Paul meant in Romans when he said, we are free from the law. Not that one was free to commit sin and that there was no law, but that one could repent in Christ and avoid the penalties for sin required by the law. So in summary, when we look at the events after the Israelites got in the wilderness, before they got to the Promised Land, mainly around Sinai and the long-term ramifications of that, the prophecy in Jeremiah 31 promised that the new covenant would bring forgiveness of sins and the Spirit of God to place the law in the hearts of men, because those elements had been lost to Israel when they were at Sinai, because they weren't sanctified. They couldn't withstand the presence of God. And so they became highly dependent on the written law. And they developed a series of written rabbinic explanations of the law of Moses and more commandments to clarify other commandments. And Christ condemned this when he came. He condemned it as the tradition of the elders in Matthew 15. The early rabbis, though, they justified it by saying it constituted an oral law. And they said it was revealed to Moses atop the mountain at the same time as the written law, and was passed to Moses, to Joshua, then the elders, the prophets, and finally the rabbis. So these people who were teaching all of this extra stuff claimed that it came all the way down from Moses' time, and that the Lord told Moses while he was on the mountaintop. However, there's other rabbinic traditions, like we saw in the Zohar, and early Christian traditions that support Joseph's teaching that the higher law had been presented to Israel, who rejected it, which made it necessary for God to give a lesser law that withheld many of the blessings he wanted to give them, and that those blessings would not be restored until the Messiah came. And, pretty much all Christians believe that Christ brought a higher law, that the law of Moses was not the higher law. But Joseph taught that this law had been known to earlier generations. Early Jewish and Christian texts tell a similar story, but they had lost it due to disobedience. So what about us? This is all interesting, but this all happened thousands of years ago. What about us? The Israelites had the higher law, and they lost it, and so they were given a lesser law. Which law do we have? Well, some would say that we have the higher law. But I just want to point out a couple of things. I'm not going to say yes or no. I just want to point out a couple of things. In Richard Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, he talks about what happened with Moses, and he talks about the early days of the church. He says, in the temple, the long-awaited endowment of power was to take place. Joseph hoped his saints would face God as Moses' people never could. He goes on to say, Oliver Cowdery told the 12, when they were ordained in February 1835, that they were not to go to other nations till you receive your endowments, because they had not known Jesus in mortality. These modern apostles had to know him by revelation. Never cease striving until you have seen God face to face, Cowdery told them. And we see that in the Doctrine and Covenants. Doctrine and Covenants 88:68. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time and in his own way, and according to his own will. And then later in Doctrine and Covenants 93, verily thus saith the Lord, it shall come to pass that every soul who forsaketh his sins, and cometh unto me, and calleth on my name, and obeyeth my voice, and keepeth my commandments, shall see my face, and know that I am. And then Doctrine and Covenants 84. Remember, we read that earlier. It talked about Moses' people not being able to withstand the face of God. And so they were cursed. Well, does anybody remember what Doctrine and Covenants 84 goes on to say? Ezra Taft Benson talked about it in a very well-known talk. He said in 1986 April General Conference, unless we read the Book of Mormon and give heed to its teachings, the Lord has stated in section 84 of the Doctrine and Covenants that the whole church is under condemnation. In our day, the Lord has revealed the need to re-emphasize the Book of Mormon to get the church and all the children of Zion out from under condemnation, the scourge, and judgment. So Moses had to sanctify his people so that they could withstand the presence of God, see God face to face, so that they could have the higher law. He wasn't able to do that. The higher law was taken away, and they were living a lower law. Joseph Smith wanted to get the saints to that same place, because Moses never could do it. Oliver Cowdery told the apostles they had to be able to see God. In Doctrine and Covenants, more than just those two that we read, said you have to prepare yourself, you have to see God. And then in 84, the Lord places the entire church under condemnation. Ezra Taft Benson says in the mid-80s that that was never lifted. And we have Dallin H. Oaks. So, we're still under condemnation. because we are not using the Book of Mormon to bring us to Christ. So do we have the higher law? Are we living the higher law? Moses' people weren't. They wanted somebody placed between them and God. Can't say that we're really all that much different. So, something to think about there. Thank you.